My name is Michael O'Rourke. I am Interim Director of the MSU Center for Interdisciplinarity. The center is the unit that has initiated and runs the University Interdisciplinary Colloquium with the support of the College of Arts and Letters. Our intention with this series is to highlight the ways in which the arts and humanities contribute to interdisciplinary research and teaching. We are excited about being an event on campus that celebrates the power of the arts and humanities to make a difference in interdisciplinary contexts. These presentations have been taking place this semester, and it's our intention to keep them going into next year. We are, among other things, interested in demonstrating how the arts and humanities can function in collaboration with other interests, so scientific interests in research off campus, to push forward interdisciplinary projects that focus on complex problems and other problems that are of significant interest to those of us who are working in the university today. Before I introduce our speaker, I would like to call attention to a couple of other events that will take place within the University Interdisciplinary Colloquium over the next month. The next time we meet will be in 2 weeks. We'll gather at 108 Kresge to hear Professor Adam Brown. He will deliver a presentation entitled Bioremediating Greenness, Rethinking Human Exceptionalism. That's Professor Adam Brown from the Department of Art, History, and Design. 2 weeks after that, on the 27th of April, we'll be back here to hear Dr. Natalie Phillips from the Department of English deliver a presentation entitled Breaking Neuro Ground, Literary Neuroscience and the Benefits of Interdisciplinarity. That will be on the 27th of April in this room. Today, we're very, very pleased to have with us Professor Rocio Quispe Agnoli. Professor Quispe Agnoli is a professor of Hispanic Studies with specialization in colonial Latin American literatures and cultures in the Department of Romance and Classical Studies. She is also core faculty of the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies and affiliated faculty in the American Indian and Indigenous Studies program. Her research interests include issues of race, ethnicity, and identity, women's and gender studies, visual studies and circulation of images among different media, and reflections on coloniality. Her latest book, Novels on Paper, received the 2017 LASA Book Award of the Peru section. And today she's with us to deliver a talk entitled Looking Without Seeing, Illusion and Consumption of the Indian Body. Professor Quispe.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you. What I'm going to present today is just the tip of the iceberg of a way larger project that goes across the centuries. I'm just going to talk today about the 15th, 16th, and early 17th centuries representations of Indian bodies. But I have other pieces, and this is a really, really large project, other pieces that go into the 18th and 19th century, and then into the 20th century, until the mid-20th century with photography. Yeah? So I'm going to start for the sake of time. Let me see. Yeah. Okay. Between 1467 and 1471, Hans Memling, a German-born Flemish artist, painted The Last Judgment, a work commissioned by Jacopo Tani, the Italian banker of the Medici family. The triptych shows Jesus Christ presiding over the Last Judgment, while Archangel St. Michael uses scales to weigh souls and decide their fate. In 1485, Memling finished another triptych called Earthly Vanity and Salvation, which you have here in the site, no? In which right panel, he depicted a demon pushing souls into the mouth of hell. How do these Christian representations of the soul relate to the images of Pictae of Scotland, drawn by John White in the 16th century, and later engraved by Theodore de Brie in late 16th century. Regarded as savage warriors, the Pictae people lived around the rivers of Scotland before the 10th century. The Romans called them the Pictae people because the Latin word Pictae meant painted or tattooed. Going back to my question, what do 15th century religious paintings of the souls and 16th century drawings and engravings of Pictae have in common? Nudity, either associated with vulnerability or savagery. These early modern images made by European artists did not intend to represent bodies of the indigenous peoples of the Americas. They are, however, recognizable as a point of reference for the Western imagination of the unknown that included places, nature, and peoples of the New World. They are also the product of visual experiences that included decoding, perception, and consumption, recoding, representation of what was seen and not seen, recirculation and recycling of images that mimicked the representation of such visual experiences. In today's presentation, I reflect about the illusion and consumption of indigenous peoples of the Americas by decoding visual experiences about the body and the mimicry of such experiences. Representations of the body exist in writing, drawings, paintings, engravings, where the viewer or the reader, sought information and meaning. Viewer and reader are visual subjects, in the words of Nicolas Mirzoeff. That is, a person who is both constituted as an agent of sight and as the effect of a series of visual experiences. The relations between the one who sees, the agent of sight, and the one who is seen, the object of sight, reveals powers weight and balance in favor and against one or the other. I propose then to examine today visual events in which European subjects looked at the indigenous people of the Americas and intended to transmit what they thought they were seeing. They were visual consumers of the Indian body, and they were also outsiders to the subjectivity of the Indian. To this date, and this is part of my larger project, to this date, I have identified at least 4 paradigms, and actually there are more than 4, on seeing, quote, seeing the Indians in the Americas. These paradigms, I contend, responded to different creative interests and political agendas in different contexts. The visual events that I comment here are examples of the early modern paradigm that ruled viewers' artistic, religious, and economic interests. By comparing and contrasting the Indian body as an object of visual representation in writing or in visual iconic images or both, one may uncover expectations of racial identity among other expectations, and how the reception of these representations responded to the projected expectations of the viewer. In the next minutes, I examine with you images produced by or inspired by the works of these travelers that you see in the slide to the Americas. These individuals had first-hand visual experiences. They were eyewitnesses and also managed indirect evidence, second-hand experience, based on what the others told them about the Indians of the Americas. These include Christopher Columbus, Jean de Lery, who spent some time with the Tupinamba Indians of the Amazon, Jacques Lemoine, who spent time with the Timucua Indians in northern Florida, and Joseph de Acosta, who wrote extensively about Aztecs and Incas in the late 16th century. I'm not going to get into Acosta because there is no time. I'm going to speak about the first 3. Note also that the works of these writers or artists were selected for printing and publication by Theodore de Bry, the German printmaker who published a series of illustrated books about the voyages of discovery around the world. Theodore de Bry, and this was my point of departure for this project. Theodore de Bry, who's very, very well known and famous, you know, it's all over the web today, you know, never came to the Americas. And still, his 12 volumes of the Grand Voyages, America, published between 1590 and 1623, disseminated some of the most popular visual narratives about the Americas and the Indians throughout the Western world. So my first, one of the first questions that I started thinking about this was how someone who was never in the Americas and who had never seen an Indian of the Americas, how was this person able to transmit representations of these Indians to others who had not seen them either, you know? And the first text that describes the Indians of the Americas is Christopher Columbus' letter. So that's why I start with Columbus's letter. And I am absolutely fascinated by the cognitive process, how people process or imagination or create images in their minds based on what they are reading, although they have never seen the object or the subject. So that is what started this. And the focus on nudity, I owe this to a joint discovery with my graduate students in my graduate seminars, because we always look into many of these texts, especially Columbus, and we were trying to understand the representations of Indians, and then we realized that the distinctive feature for Columbus and his men and others who follow was that they were naked. Not so much other things, but that was a distinctive feature that they were naked, and that they were surprised by that, and they didn't care. The Indians didn't care, and being naked didn't have an erotic value. So, okay. So let's continue. From the medieval to the early modern paradigm. Christopher Columbus spent 3 months in the Caribbean islands during his first voyage in 1492. He first landed in present-day Bahamas, then went on to Cuba, and he finally arrived to Hispaniola, which is today Dominican Republic and Haiti. He arrived to Hispaniola in early December 1492, and in mid-January 1493, he sailed back to Europe. The time is important because it's going to give you an idea of how much experience Columbus had before writing about the Indians. When he sailed back, he was trying to go back to Spain, and due to storms or weather, he ended up in Portugal, which was enemy of Spain. So it was not the desired path for Columbus. But he managed to leave Portugal and continue to Spain. He reached Barcelona on March 15, 1493. And his famous letter announcing the discovery of the Indies was published in Barcelona in early April 1493. This is very significant because it took a little bit more than 2 weeks to publish the letter in the printing press, which is amazing for the time. Yeah, it went extremely fast. So just to give you an idea of the dimension of the event. Translations and editions followed. An Italian edition, which you have is the first image in the slide. An Italian edition in verse included an illustration. This is the first illustration of the Indians, in which King Fernando observes the event from his throne and points at it while naked Indians with long hair seem to flee the scene. In 1494, which are the two in the middle, the Basel edition of the letter in Latin included 5 illustrations, one of which depicted the very moment of the arrival of the Europeans, while naked Indians alternate between receiving gifts of the newcomers, curiosity, or fleeing, fear. It is important to note that the Indians depicted in these 2 illustrations make reference to the Indians of Hispaniola, where Columbus spent around 6 weeks. The Taino Indians, which are the Indians of these islands, the ethnicity of these islands, were described by Columbus as primitive, peaceful, innocent, timid, fearful, cowards, and, quote, naked as their mothers bore them. They also lacked technologies and weaponry. Their bodies were described as beautiful, with little or no hair, in contrast with the long, straight, and dark hair both men and women carried. Generous, handsome, and naive, the natives of Hispaniola were willing to exchange pieces of gold for objects with little or no value for the Europeans. In other words, they were represented naked and innocent like children. Their nudity did not invoke an erotic value, but that of the innocence before the man's fall from paradise. Their fear displayed their vulnerability that goes in hand with their nudity. Their beautiful bodies were also neutral and exposed like those of the souls in the Last Judgment. That means that genitals and other markers of sexuality are not shown. Their nudity evoked the exposed bodies of the souls that cannot hide their true nature. Furthermore, Columbus went on saying that he interacted enough with the Indians to understand that what they were saying, and he noticed that they were void of religious beliefs, and therefore they were categorized as idolaters. 100 years later, Columbus's visual experience of the Indias is included in Fyodor Debris' 4th volume of the Grand Voyages. He departs, however, from Girolamo Benzoni, an Italian historian, who wrote Historia del Mundo Nuovo in 1565. Debris represented Columbus's encounter with the Taínos in this plate that is to the right of the slide. The Indians bring gifts, described as gold necklaces, and a box full of jewels and gold, as well as other artifacts that the Taínos did not actually have. The beauty of their hairless, naked body matches their friendly and welcoming attitudes. Their bodies, however, are far from the reference of the naked souls in the Last Judgment. For once, their genitals are covered with loincloths, their long, straight hair has become short, and in the background, the fearful ones run away from the Spanish. Their exposed bodies seem tall, strong, muscular, a clear reference to the ideal bodies of classicism. The Europeans are fully dressed and carry objects related to conquest and colonization, the cross, swords, a banner. This welcoming story, however, is exceptional in Benzoni's history and Debris' illustration. Benzoni was known for his deep-rooted hatred against the Spaniards and a very limited view of the events he may have witnessed or read. His work is full of mistakes and misrepresentations, as they have been studied extensively today. The title page of Benzoni's work, published by Debris, which is what you have here to the right, is revealing. In this page, the New World and its people are represented in the light of savagery and erotic naked bodies with the attributes stereotypically associated with all Indians of the continent, which are feather skirts and crowns of feathers. The women carry long and untidy hair, similar to the image of the wall woman in European folklore. They are immersed in a natural paradise, but they worship a demon-like figure that reproduces the same features of Mengling's devil, which is at the top of the frontispiece. The vulnerable, naked souls are now gone. The Indian body is beautiful to European eyes, savage and evil at the same time. This prepares us for the most feared and monstrous expression of the Indian, as we see next. And we are now in the very much into the early modern paradigm. Jean de Lery, who lived in the 15th century and early 16th century, is one of the renowned early modern authors who wrote and personally supervised the production of engravings of the savages in the New World to illustrate his History of a Voyage to the Land of Brazil, published in 1578. Between 1557 and 1558, he was a member of the Protestant French expedition to the colony of France Antarctique, present-day Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. The colony failed, and the French colonists lived for a short time in the mainland, close to the Amazon, amongst the Tupinamba. Eventually, Léry returned to France and was exposed to the religious wars between Protestants and Catholics. Léry survived the siege and massacre of Sancerre in 1572 and sought refuge in Geneva, where he returned to writing his account about Brazil. His account on the Tupinamba culture became, in time, an ethnographic masterwork with scientific authority that was not challenged until very recently, and very recently is 2003, 2004. Okay. One example drawn from Léry's work illustrates how the visual perception worked along written text to convey a reality to the European reader. In his description of the Tupinamba, the French Huguenot colonist described the natives in his own words, pointing out their nudity, artifacts, and ornaments. I'm going to read a quote that is not in the slide. Yeah, and then we'll go into the quote of the slide. If you would picture yourself a savage, this is what Léry writes before showing the image, you may imagine in your mind, votre entendement, a naked man, well-formed, unproportioned in his limbs, with all the hair on his body plucked out, his hair shaved in the fashion I have described, the cheeks and the lips slit, with pointed bones or green stone set in them, his ears pierced with pendants in the holes, his thighs and legs blackened with the dye they make, and with necklaces made of little pieces of the big seashell that they call vignol. End of quote. He ends his description of the Indian by addressing his reader in the following way, and the quote is there in the slide. Thus, you will see him as he usually is in his country, and as far as his natural condition is concerned, such as you will see him portrayed in the following illustration, wearing only his crescent of polished sponge on his breast, his stone in the hollow in his lip, and to show his general bearing, his unbent bow and his arrows in his hands. To fill out this plate, we have put near the Tupinamba one of his women who, in their customary way, is holding her child in a cotton scarf. End of quote. Now, this is what Léry writes first. The writing comes first, and then the engraving comes appears in the next page. In the following page, the reader would see an engraving of a naked Indian accompanied by a woman and a child. The group is surrounded by exotic objects associated with the wonders of the New World, a hammock and a pineapple. What is noticeable here is Léry's use of the visual experience as an element of early modern ethnographic discourse, and also as an evidence of the true Indian, both supported by his own first-hand experience as an eyewitness. In the early modern paradigm, first-hand seeing is crucial for the truth of narrated events. Some decades later, Francis Bacon would emphasize the value of seeing as a sine qua non factor of the factual truth of events in his Instauratio Magna from 1620. And Bacon would state this in the following terms, quote, all depends on keeping the eye steadily fixed upon the facts of nature, and so receiving their images simply as they are. For God forbid that we should give out a dream of our own imagination for a pattern of the world. End of quote. In other words, the understanding of what I see is real, what I see is what is there, dominated early modern historiography and pretty much dominates many of what is still happening today, I think. Okay. Now, the consumption of the body, of the Indian body. In her 2003 study of Léry's representation of the Tupinamba, Castro-Claren noticed that the body of the Indians became, in the early modern visual experience, the place for the elaboration of the other. It is known that the Tupinamba practiced anthropophagia. In his letter of discovery, Columbus pointed out that while the Taínos of Hispaniola were beautiful and innocent, like vulnerable souls of the good, he had heard, although not seen, that there were other Indians who were ferocious and ate human flesh. Although these Indians were not bad-looking, according to Columbus, he called them monsters in 1492. Interestingly, he did not use the word cannibal. The word cannibal comes way later in historiography. The title page of Debris' third volume, which you have there of the Grand Voyages, shows Indian men and women in the act of eating human body parts. The women look visually similar to the plate used, to the one in the plate used by Léry to introduce the Tupinamba family, and one of the women carries a child while consuming an arm. Nevertheless, Castro-Claren has convincingly demonstrated that Léry's detailed accounts of ritualistic cannibalism among the Tupinamba were the product of colonial fantasies of the New World Order. Debris' volume took on these fantasies and expanded their projections thanks to the printing press. Léry's fascination with anthropophagy, as well as Debris and their readers, originated, according to Castro-Claren, in European anxieties about the status of the Eucharist as body in the wake of the Protestant Reformation. Consumption of human flesh and theophagy, the consumption of divine flesh, were doctrinal issues that the Church struggled to resolve in Léry's time. We should remember that there is a distance of approximately 20 years between Léry's first-hand experience, he was around 22 years old when he was in Brazil, and the publication of his account, he was like 38 years old. Yeah. During these years, the French writer witnessed anthropophagia as a consequence of the religious wars between Protestants and Catholics. He witnessed anthropophagia in Europe. Therefore, to understand the Tupinamba's relation with the human body and its consumption, says Castro-Claren, it's necessary to pay attention to their language, as well as to rituals linked to their beliefs of natural order. First, Léry's knowledge and understanding of the Tupi language were extremely limited and subject to interpretation. Next, his authority as eyewitness is also subject to cultural coding and decoding. Léry had read from other historians about the Andean treatment of the body, the mummification, and its careful preservation, embalming technology, and the extreme desire to preserve the body. The French writer compared his anxiety to preserve the body to the Tupi's consumption and dissolution of human flesh in the belly of the other. The issue at stake here is not only the preservation or dissolution of the body, but, as Castro-Claren proposes, where the limits of the body are and how these limits define what a person is among different Indian and European societies. Anthropologist Viveiros de Castro has explained that the Awarete, which are the contemporary carriers of Tupi culture, have the following belief about the fate of human body. Quote, they say that once the soul of the dead has arrived in the heavens, they are devoured by the immortals, who then bring together the bones and the skin. After soaking the cadaver in a bath, they resuscitate the body of the deceased, who then goes on to join the ranks of the immortals. End of quote. In this way, the consumption of the body and its death is one step in the 2P life-death cycle to become another, to become other. We can observe then that how Léris and Debris and other writers like Hans Staden and Benzoni viewed certain indigenous groups of the Americas as more barbaric than others and represented them as demonic flesh eaters in spite of their beautiful appearance. Their visually graphic representations that do not spare details responded to projections of European fears about the fate of the human body. And now we move to Florida. Theodore Debris' second volume of his Grand Voyages brings us now to look at the pierced and tattooed Indian body as a receptacle of order and deviation, which may sound similar to Columbus's Taínos, but also in a different light. We look now at French visual and written depictions of Florida Indians. If we make a Google search for Florida Indians, Debris engravings come right away. It's the Debris engravings of the Timucua, which is the ethnic group we're going to see here. This is significant because not only Debris images made the Timucua known to the 16th century reader, but his engravings are still used to portray them. The 42 illustrations in this volume are based on drawings and watercolors created by Jacques Lemoine, a French artist. He produced them between 1564 and 65, and later by John White in the 1580s. Botanical artist and cartographer Jacques Lemoine accompanied René de Laudonnière in the second French attempt to colonize Florida. They arrived to the Jacksonville area and built Fort Caroline in today's Blount's Island. The French explored the area and made contact with the Timucua. In 1565, another French expedition arrived to Fort Caroline, but they were attacked by the Spanish, led by Pedro Menéndez de Avilés. Laudonnière, Lemoine, and other men escaped and returned to Europe. Laudonnière offered a personal report to King Charles IX in 1566 and wrote an account of his 3 voyages to Florida. Interestingly, Laudonnière did not mention the works of Lemoine, who was appointed officially as the cartographer and illustrator to the expedition. Lemoine, in turn, sailed back to England, and he drew again his sketches of the Timucua, because they had been lost during the Spanish attack. He also told his Florida experiences to the King of France, Charles IX. Lemoine wrote in more detail than Laudonnière about the Indians, and included illustrations on a map. After his death in 1588, Debris bought from his widow his manuscript and drawings. The accounts of both men, Laudonnière and Lemoine, tell about their negotiations with the Timucua, and they describe the Indians' appearances, customs, and ceremonies. These observations may be motivated by the curiosity of the new, but also by the French interest to succeed in their negotiations in the most effective way, the negotiations with the European reader, or the future European reader in the case of Lemoine. With this in mind, Laudonnière's account describes situations in which he engaged with the Timucua and ceremonies that he could not understand, but he insisted in knowing, like Columbus. Instead, Lemoine's account is more descriptive of what he observed, and his drawings have been preserved through Debris' gaze. I'm not suggesting that neither Lemoine nor Debris were not motivated by a colonial mindset. They were. But we can also observe an emphasis in presenting the new and the unknown through models of reference that these authors had for what they understood as other, different, or uncivilized. Let's look now at one scene that depicts the first encounter between a Timucua chief and Laudonnière in 1564. This is plate 8 in the Breeze volume number 2, and it's titled, "The Natives of Florida Worship the Column Erected by the Commander of the First Voyage." It shows a tall Indian that seems to mediate between Europeans and a group of Indians who kneeled before a European-like column. This column displays a coat of arms and is adorned with wreaths. At the foot of the column, there are offerings. The scene can be interpreted as a ritual. The text that accompanies this engraving, provided by Debris, says the following. Quote, "During the second voyage to Florida under Laudonnière's command, he was greeted by the Indians who had gathered in crowds to see the new arrivals. Their king welcomed him with great kindness and presented Laudonnière with gifts. He gave the French to understand that he wished to show them something remarkable. He conducted them to the island where Ribault had erected on a hill the column engraved with the arms of the King of France. On approaching, the French saw the Indians worshiping the stone as an idol. The chief, having saluted it with the respect that his subjects were used, kissed it, and the other Indians did likewise. Afterwards, the French were encouraged to do the same." The stage ceremony to welcome the French is censored by Laudonnière since he calls the Indians wretched barbarians. In contrast, the description that accompanies the Breeze plate seems to be a compilation of ideas from Lemoine's and Laudonnière's account. Lemoine's narrative speaks of testimonies of friendships and gifts. Furthermore, in 1955, an archaeologist found a Timucua owl totem with a cylinder shape similar to the column referred in this image, which is what you see there. The similarities in shape may help us understanding the Timucua act of worshiping as a friendly welcome to the French. Or maybe I'm thinking now as a declaration of war, which is what happened in the Caribbean islands, and Columbus didn't understand it. Today we know that Columbus thought that the Caribbean chiefs were welcoming him because they were giving him gifts, etc., and they were actually declaring war to him. He didn't understand the ritual. But that is something that we have figured out in recent years. Okay. Laudonnière did not name the chief in his account. Debris, however, described the Timucua chief in the following terms. Quote, this is from Debris. "The king Athore is a handsome man, wise, honorable, strong, more than half a foot taller than even the tallest of our men. His modest gravity lends majesty to his already noble bearing. He married his mother and had by her several children of both sexes whom he proudly introduced to us, striking his thigh as he did so. It might be added that after he married his mother, his father, Saturiwa, ceased to live with her." End of quote. Laudonnière describes Saturiwa, whom he met the following day of the previous encounter, in the following terms. This is from Laudonnière. "He was clothed with great deer skin and painted in a strange design of various colors. The paintings were so naturally charming and so consistent with the rules of art that no professional artist could find fault with them." Lemoine did not describe any of these kings, but he did offer an account of how the Timucua warriors and men of importance looked like. In these representations, the Timucua chief and his men are naked and their skin is covered by piercings, colorful tattoos, jewelry, a tall headdress, deerskin loincloth, and a belt. This outfit contrasts with the long sleeve layers of clothing of the European soldiers. In the Caribbean, Mexico, and Peru, the European clothes were interpreted as a necessity to hide deformities or sick bodies. These 15th, 16th, and 17th century descriptions of the Indian body fostered the European imagination about the strange people that existed in the unthinkable torrid zone. After 1492, the Europeans soon realized that naked men with dog faces, one eye, and feet backwards seemed not to exist as they thought. However, these imaginary beings were replaced in Florida by 7 foot or taller naked men who would incise their body in their skin. Those are the tattoos. Contemporary anthropological research has demonstrated that the Timucua were in fact tall, especially for their time, but they would not be taller than 6 feet. Seen from the perspective of a 5'6" average Spaniard or French, the Timucua men and women looked very tall. Also, Timucua men would arrange their hair in a bun on top of their heads, making them look taller. In addition, it has been amply confirmed that the Timucua body was extensively tattooed, not only as an ornament, as the Europeans thought, but as a way to visually mark the person's status in society. Tattoos were gained by deeds, and children would begin to get their tattoos as they took more responsibilities. The more tattoos on the body, the higher standing in society. Lemoine's drawings did not only serve as a visual source for Debris engravings, but also inspired English illustrator John White, who also drew the Scottish Pictae, the Indians of Virginia, and Timucua male and female bodies. This is where you have the comparison. John White, so you have Debris, Lemoine, and John White. This is the Pictae. Yeah? John White added color to his drawing, and that were not to his drawings that were not included in Debris' black and white engravings. The dark skin color of the Timucua responds to Laudonnière's description in the introduction of his account. Although White claimed that his main source was Lemoine's drawings, yeah, it is interesting to compare these images with those of the red-haired, tall, and fierce Pictae. John White imagined and drew the Picts as noble savages, following classical sources, but also inspired by Lemoine's drawings of the Timucua and his experience with the Roanoke Indians of Virginia. However, we cannot put aside White's drawings of the Pictae warrior covered in tattoos like the Timucua. His body is strong, tall, muscular, but he also carries on his abdomen, chest, and thighs, or knees, terrifying faces that in the early modern imagination reminded the iconography of the devil. Their bodies share what Sarah Castro-Claren pointed out as the locus or place of otherness, not understood and taken to the extreme or opposite side of normalcy for a European reader. Debris also found interesting enough Lemoine's rendering of what he called hermaphrodites. In several Amerindian societies, and North America was not exception, there were 2 spirit people, a concept also used among the Timucua to refer to those the French called berdaches. These were Indians who would fulfill combined gender roles. For example, they would wear clothing and accessories associated with both men and women and would perform male and female chores in the community. The 2-spirit male was considered fundamental in their community, for they would help to keep the balance of natural male and female forces. One form to distinguish the berdache from the warrior men was for them to fluff their hair, as you can see here, and not to tie it in a bun on top of their heads. Neither Lemoine nor Laudonnière, and even less Debris, understood the role of the berdache among the Timucuas. Instead, they interpreted them as sodomites or hermaphrodites who were rejected by their own community and almost enslaved and obliged to perform the most disgusting daily tasks the rest didn't want to perform, like taking care of the sick and the dead. This plate shows the berdache at work, and the description that accompanies the plate states the following. In this country, there are numerous hermaphrodites, a mixture of both sexes, They are considered odious by the Indians. But as they are robust and strong, they are used to carry loads instead of beasts of burden. When the kings set out to war, it is the hermaphrodites who transport the supplies. They place the Indians dead from either wounds or sickness on a stretcher made of 2 stout poles covered with a mat of woven thin canes. Persons with infectious diseases are carried to places reserved for them on the shoulders of the hermaphrodites, who supply them with food until they are well again. The next slide I'm not going to read, just want to give you an idea. This comes from Joseph de Acosta, a Spanish writer who published in 1590, and then Debris selected some episodes of Acosta's history, which is very, very extensive, to depict the Indians of Peru, the Incas. And the interesting thing here is that he chose to depict the Indians of Peru in relation to the llamas. What calls the attention of Debris are the llamas. That is the element of Peruvianness or Incas. And then when you look very closely into the engraving, you see that the representation, this is supposed to be a representation of an Inca man, responds to the model used to represent Amazonian Tupinamba. This is very far from what Joseph de Acosta is trying to represent. So to finish, these examples of the representations of the 16th century Indian and European bodies are not isolated cases. Other notable Spanish and German travelers experienced similar experiences, and they themselves became Indianized in their physical appearance as well as behavior and customs. European visual experiences and renderings of the Indian body reveal how the Europeans dealt with what I call corporeal imagination. From one end, these accounts express a fascination and attraction to the handsome, naked Indian body of the Taínos, Tupinambá, Timucua, along with the Aztecs, Mayas, and Incas, which are represented according to European imaginations of the wild man in some cases, and with the noble savage of ancient times, the Pictae. However, Indian bodies that deviate from this expected ideal, like the Berdache among the Timucua or the cannibals, are perceived and represented as a transgression of normative behavior that is removed from humankind, and they are considered more beast than men. In other end, the European travelers, explorers, artists, and writers who had first-hand visual experiences with the others did not address their bodies, their own bodies, unless they were in extreme distress. If this happened, the European body was compared with the idealized, tortured body of the biblical martyrs that accepted their fate to get closer to the suffering, exposed, and tormented body of Jesus Christ. The Indian bodies, in contrast, were perceived as the vulnerable, naked souls of the Last Judgment only at the very beginning. Soon, they became incarnations of the wild man or the savage warrior, the monstrous cannibal, the deviated gender, the devil, the body of the devil, in some, the place of otherness. Thank you. Thank you.
Do you have time for?
Absolutely, yes. Yes. It's a lot of information, I'm aware too, so yeah. Oh, I'm sorry, Dan. Yes.
So I have a larger thought, which is your research question is so fascinating to me in terms of, as a theater person, how does an actor then
it's a performance,
right? How do you perform the role of an Indian in this period? I'm not sure that there are necessarily plays doing that. I mean, I know in the 1660s in England you start to get those performances, and surely those performers are not naked on stage. But it makes me really interested in that. I guess the question that I have is at the end of your presentation about the word bardage, because in French in the 18th century, bardage means specifically a passive sodomite. And so I'm wondering about the etymology of that word. Do you have a sense of that?
No, I have heard the word many times, but that is the term that Laudonnière and Lemoine used to refer to those in-between or ambivalent subjects, individuals. They have a word, and I don't remember the word, but when it's translated, it's loosely translated into two-spirit, because that kind of gender ambivalent or dual gender individual is not an isolated case for the Timucua. It appears in different ethnic groups. Yeah, and Laudonnière and Lemoine, they just call them Pictae. And they condemned it. But when you go into what is great is that for us, for people of us, is that I'm a literary scholar, and then I have gone carefully into visual studies, because I'm fascinated by the interaction between written and visual text, and because I asked this question: how did Columbus do to transmit his idea of the Indians to someone who has never seen one? So, and he only had writing, you know. And then I'm fascinated by debris, because he was never in the Americas, and he has expanded all the images about the Indians of the Americas through 500 years. Yeah, so that was I'm fascinated by that process of reception, consumption, reproduction, circulation of images, and how things get distorted. But the funny thing is that the reader ends up believing it. That's how things are. So the Timucua two spirits become Berdache, and they're hermaphrodite sodomites, end of the story. Yeah, so that's why we call about the Indian body is the place of otherness. No. Yeah. The performance aspect, I have thought a lot about that, because there is a lot of performance. The problem is how to detect it.
Right.
And to detect it, we have to work with anthropologists. I work a lot with cultural anthropologists. It's wonderful. And that's where the interdisciplinary comes. You know, this is not the kind of work you can do just within what discipline. Yeah.
No, and certainly in later periods you get very exoticizing representation. Like Les Gallant is the Gallant Indies.
The other thing going back to Columbus is so interesting, because for centuries it was thought that the Indians of the Caribbean were welcoming him. They were being, it was a ritual announcing war. We're going to make war to you. So he misunderstood completely, or he put things the way that were convenient to him, you know. So, and that is the work of ethnologists and anthropologists that we have to work with. The other thing I'm fascinated with, and I need to work with people, not only with art historians, but with people who work with the cognitive process of seeing, is that I have realized seeing is culturally conditioned. So there are things we see and there are things we don't see. That is very interesting. Yeah.
Coming from it as an art historian or a history of the print person,
yes,
I like what you said about the context of seeing. And so I'm looking at the early Christopher Columbus images and the proportions of the body, which is so typical for that period. Then the next one you showed a very mannerist, or what art historians would call mannerist proportions, where the head gets small, waist gets small, the thighs get long. And then when you showed the John White image, if you can go back to that, I think of all of the history of David and Goliath.
Yeah.
I mean,
I think it's that one.
And he was looking at sculpture, he's looking at Donatello.
That is where I am at. What were they? That's the question I asked about that. What were they looking at? You know?
And contrapposto, perfect contrapposto of that figure.
Yes.
There's a very long visual history for that one.
Yes, and what fascinating, since I come from the letters, I'm a literary scholar, I work with text, I said, okay, how can writing can convey what I cannot see? Yeah, and that's what Columbus had at the time, and others had at the time. And that is why when Debris comes with his copper plates and his big enterprise, he was a success, as you well know very well. He was a success, and even today. And the issue and the good and the bad is that Debris engravings have spread the idea of the Indian in the Americas until today. Really, I was surprised when I started looking into the Timucua. You type in Google Timucua, and the first thing that comes are the Debris engravings that were made 500 years ago, 400 years ago.
But there
That
they
is-
are in this very perspectival setting,
Yes.
which is so typical for book production.
Yes.
This is bizarre.
The other fascinating thing that I got to learn with this project is how the Debris, because it's the father and the sons, you know, it's a family business. How did they do to produce the books? Because they were not authored by Debris alone. I mean, it was team production, as you well know. You know, some members of his team will take care of the engravings, and then some were, I remember, tasked with making the research, you know, and reading and translating, because Acosta was written in Spanish, for instance. You know, translating, reading, understanding, making the research so they can imagine the llama. And in another work that was published in 2014 or 15, I was able to, well, I don't know if I was able to, but I traced a potential model of reference for the llama in Conrad Gessner's History of Animals from 1565, I think. There is a mythical animal called Alocamelus that is the model, I think, is the visual reference for the llama. Because if you look at the llamas of Debris, they look more like camels. Yeah, so I was thinking, and he was absolutely fascinated by the llama, and that's why when you see, why is he so fascinated by the llama? You know, he has never seen one, but he was absolutely fascinated, and that's what he chose to make reference to the Incas, the llamas. Interesting, you know? I like that kind of stuff. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's David and the head of Goliath.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much.